Good evening and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm Elliot Margolis. I'm here with my co-host Gail Burke and special guest today from 40 plus years ago, my college roommate, Paul Drager. Paul is a adjunct professor at UNH. He teaches medical ethics, and he's been teaching medical ethics for an awful lot of years, quite a few years, I would say. Huh, Paul?
About 20.
About 20 years. And we have a very interesting show for you today. But Paul, first I want to just ask you about this button that I'm wearing, which says, have you started your conversation? What does that really mean, Paul?
Well, it means a couple of things. One is that there's a recognition, and has been a recognition, that people have not been able to really have their voices heard when it comes to end-of-life care. And oftentimes people are reluctant to even raise that as a discussion item because they're afraid of their own mortality. As it turns out, one of the things that's been going on nationally is on April 16th of each year, there's what's known as National Healthcare Decisions Day. And that button is actually in commemoration of that, and we generally break those out every April 16th. And oftentimes on those dates, there will be states that will actually commemorate it, declare it as a special state, for a special state proclamation or something along those lines. What we've discovered is, and over time, is that people, again, not only are afraid to discuss their own mortality, but more importantly, oftentimes even the medical profession is afraid to bring it up, the subject itself. Because if the docs bring up the subject about one's mortality, patients may think that, oh my God, is there something wrong with me? What is my doctor trying to say to me? And in reality, they're just trying to encourage you to think about the future. And that's one thing that advance directives have.
Well, it's very difficult for some people to talk to their families about it because sometimes, especially the children, don't want to hear it.
Well, you know, what needs to be done is really we need to normalize the discussion and the conversation. And a good colleague of mine has a way of doing that. She herself is a geriatrician. She is kind of like the matriarch of the family. And each year up in Rochester, New York, she and her 4 sisters and all their families meet in her home in Rochester, and the rest of her family's from Pennsylvania, and they go around the table at Thanksgiving. And this is what happens when it comes time for dessert. And that is, you don't get your pumpkin pie until you tell us how you want to die. And they've been doing this now for over 20 years. And as her kids, one of whom is now a palliative care doc, the other one is now an attorney, but they've been doing this since they were kids, their wishes changed as to what would be important to them. And by normalizing that discussion, the family then was on the same page. They knew what everyone else wanted, and they were able to respect the changes that have come about in time based on their own life experiences. And this is what we really need to do, and that's one reason then for the National Healthcare Decisions Day.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea because I think you need to do it. God forbid something should happen, you get into an accident or something terrible happens and you haven't done it, then I know I went through this with my father. I didn't know. He had had a massive heart attack and I didn't know what he wanted. He was trying to tell me and he couldn't. And the only thing that I could do was try to convince him to have the operation. The doctor said he could have an operation, and my thought was, if he doesn't make it through, at least he's not in pain anymore. He's asleep. And that's exactly what happened. He died in the recovery room.
Well, actually, it's a little bit deeper than that. And that is that if you have an advance directive, then it helps the family know that indeed they are doing the right thing, right, whatever that may be.
You're right, yeah.
That respects the values of the family and in particular of the family member that you are speaking on behalf of, so that no one needs to feel as though they are being guilty, have to feel guilty if they decide that, you know, we need to either stop, start, or continue any particular kind of medical intervention. Mm-hmm. it's interesting that one of the reasons that advance directives really came about in terms of the way that we know it now came about from a 1975 situation in New Jersey where there was a young 21-year-old woman by the name of Karen Ann Quinlan. And she unfortunately mixed some drugs and alcohol together. And the net result was that she ended up in a coma and then was diagnosed as being in a permanent vegetative state. And those are terms that I don't have enough time to go through right now. But to make a long story short, the family happened to have been Roman Catholic. And Karen was actually on both a mechanical ventilator as well as artificial nutrition with tubes for feeding and for water. And the family then had to go to court because the father wanted to be able to, and this was with the help of and backing of the entire family, wanted to speak for Karen so that, in a sense, what her values were would be respected. And the family was of the position that because of their faith, that the mechanical ventilation was extraordinary and was not required by their faith, but the artificial nutrition and hydration represented nourishment and something that they felt there was an obligation to continue. So the court, after hearing all the testimony, including from their priest, allowed her father to substitute his judgment for Karen, because Karen had nothing in writing, as to what she would want. And they were able to wean her off of the mechanical ventilation, but she stayed on the artificial nutrition and hydration for another 9 years. And she died in a fetal drawn-up position, ultimately of pneumonia. Now, because of that, two things happened. One is the court made it clear that people need to start thinking about these issues. And number two, the court suggested that hospitals have what are known as bioethics committees. If we fast forward then to 1983, there was still another case of a young woman about 24, 25 by the name of Nancy Hayes. And Nancy was actually married at the time. And she ended up in a horrific car accident just a mile from where she lived. EMS was called. She was without oxygen for something like 15 minutes. And they were able to resuscitate her, and I'll put that in quotes, but she couldn't, her brain was essentially gone. This happened in the state of Missouri, and the family was given to understand that the way that the laws were at that point in time, that they would have to continue just letting her stay in this permanent vegetative state with artificial nutrition and hydration for the rest of her life. But after about 6 or 7 years of this, the family realized that this is not who Nancy was. She was a young, vivacious woman. There's a picture of her on the cover of Time magazine on her motorcycle. She was the apple of her father's eye, and she had 3 sisters. And he then decided to fight for her. Her case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court said that what the state of Missouri wanted to do, which was to require what's known as clear and convincing evidence, to determine what it is that Nancy would want or not want, because again, she had nothing in writing. What's important to understand this, because I use the name Nancy Hayes, is that when she had this horrific accident, her husband quite literally went lickety-split. And Nancy's father then had to take on the responsibility of getting her divorced from her husband so that the family could then care for her. Her maiden name is Cruzan, Nancy Cruzan.
And let's put up the stone when we can, just to show people part of the story.
So what happened here is that Nancy was born in 1957. She had the car accident in January of 1983. Because the family did not feel that it could actually have a voice in this, she lingered on then for about another 7 or 8 years. And when it became publicly known that Nancy Hayes was the same as Nancy Cruzan, people that she had worked with, because Nancy had actually worked in a facility that took care of vent-dependent children, And the people that she worked with had all spoken and said, this is not what we would want, and that's what Nancy had said. When that testimony was then elicited, the court then allowed the artificial nutrition and hydration to be removed from Nancy, and then she died about 8 or 9 days later.
And let's talk about the stone for a minute, and then we'll get back to Live Us. But you notice on the stone that it's got her name, but I believe up top above her name is the heartbeat.
That's it. And notice it says thank you.
Right, and it says thank you, but then you see the flat line. But notice the born, departed, and then at peace. And I think that's significant when you consider she departed because she was brain dead, basically, but she was at peace when she finally passed away.
Well, in actuality, Nancy was not brain dead. She was in a permanent vegetative state. Brain death is something that goes to really the brain stem, whereas a PVS state has to do with the cerebral cortex. Okay, and if her brain stem had actually been dead, then her heart would not be beating. She would not be breathing on her own at all. And she was not on ventilation. Her heart was beating without any kind of assistance. So it's not the same as brain death. It really has to do with being in a permanent coma, permanent vegetative state. So there is that distinction. But what's really fascinating about Nancy's case is that the next year, the government, the Congress passed a new law called the Patient Self-Determination Act. And that act said for the first time, hospitals have to ask a patient when they come in, do you have an advance directive? Do you have an agent or a proxy? You have a right to have that. You have a right to know that as an adult, if you're 18 or older and competent, you have a right to start, continue, or discontinue any kind of medical treatment. That includes ventilation, it includes antibiotics, it includes artificial nutrition and hydration, it includes dialysis, you name it. All of that is included under that penumbra.
But what happens if you happen to have an accident and you go into a hospital and the doctors refuse? They will not honor what the patient wants or what the family wants.
We have to realize that if we go into a hospital, into an ER, their responsibility is to treat. That's number one. So in most cases, if emergency responders show up at your home or on the street, or you're taken to an ER room, the responsibility of that staff is actually to try to resuscitate you and to take care of you. Now, if you have an advance directive, all that does is say that you have a spokesperson who can speak on your behalf if you lack the capacity to do so, if you're incapacitated. That means that you cannot communicate to the doctors what kind of treatment that you want or do not want. So that's what the purpose of an advance directive is. I believe even here in Massachusetts, if you have an advance directive, it's to be followed, but there's a caveat to that, and there's a problem with it. An advance directive is looking toward the future. And as a result of that, you need to get at least one medical staff member, if not two, to agree that you lack capacity to make your own healthcare decisions. So one of the problems then with an advance directive is that it's legalistic in terms, the way that it's formulated and made, and it really doesn't speak to the here and now. It's looking to the future. There is something else, though, that has come about, especially since 1991, and it finally came around to this state in Massachusetts starting around 2008 or 2009. And it's called AMOLST. It stands for Medical Orders on Life-Sustaining Treatment. And what AMOLST is, it's part of the national POLST paradigm. Massachusetts calls it Medical Orders on Life-Sustaining Treatment. Many other states call it Physician Orders on Life-Sustaining Treatment. But basically what it does is it takes a look not for the situations where there may be an accident, but rather for people that are facing a terminal illness that may be in their last year of life or so. And indeed, doctors are being taught to ask the following question to themselves, because docs don't like to prognosticate what's going to happen with the patient's health. So we ask doctors to ask themselves, would you be surprised if your patient were to die within the next 12 months? And if you will not be surprised to see your patient die within the next 12 months, then that should act as a trigger to the doctor to start a conversation about a MOLST form. And what a MOLST form is, it's about the conversation. It's about communication. It's not about legalese. It's about medical treatment. It really is then patient-centered care, whereas if you want to take a look at it in other ways, sometimes things just become either legal-centered care or medical-centered care, but not about the patient. And what a MOLST form does is it allows the patient to have a discussion with the doctor and say, look, Mr. or Miss So-and-so, this is where you stand. By the way, that would be pink in the state of Massachusetts, if you can see what Elliot is holding up. But anyway, what it would do is it encourages the doctor to have a conversation and say, this is where we are. How much do you want to know? And how much do you understand? And the reason for that kind of a conversation is because people have misimpressions. Something like 67% of the US population believe that if you're placed on mechanical ventilation, it means that you're getting an oxygen mask in your nose. That's not what mechanical ventilation is. They stick a tube down your throat, and you have this piece of machinery that's going thump, 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 thump. And it is very distressing. Some people seem to believe, I think the statistics are from the recent journal articles, that maybe about 1 to 5% of the frail elderly who, for example, need CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation in a hospital, only about 1 to 5% of them are still going to be alive 6 months after they leave the hospital. People do not understand. The MOLST form says, let's have a discussion and deal with what you believe, and let's talk about the facts and what's important to you.
And what's a healthcare proxy?
Healthcare proxy, for purposes of Massachusetts, is an advanced directive. But it's a little bit different from other forms that you would find in other states. Some states really allow you to have what might be considered to be a so-called living will, where you can write out completely what kind of things you want to have done or not done to you in the event of a future event. The way Massachusetts basically works is that they are hoping that you have that kind of intensive conversation with your healthcare agent so that they know what you want or what you do not want. So the purpose of have you started your conversation is if you name somebody to be your healthcare agent and they don't know about it, or if you haven't had a discussion with them about it, what's important, it's not worth the paper it's written on, because somebody else is going to be using their values, not yours, to make those healthcare decisions for you.
Now, this MOLST form, it goes into effect as soon as you sign it, as
That's
I
correct.
understand it. What happens if, you change your mind, or do you have the opportunity to change it at any time? Or how binding is that between
All you
you
need
and
to
your
do
doctor?
is to say to your doctor, I don't want it to be in effect anymore. You can say it to EMS when they come, I don't want it to be in effect. Okay. And oftentimes, unfortunately, people, when they realize that they may be having a medical event, will suddenly step back a little bit and say, well, we'll give it a try. One of the nice things, though, about the MOLST form, and it depends on which state you are, and I don't know they necessarily see it on the Massachusetts form, but in other states, for example, in New York State, it allows for a trial period to see whether or not a particular type of intervention, medical intervention, would work on a trial basis. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. An example of that I could give you is that a colleague of mine is a neurologist. And his daughter, once upon a time, several years ago, was going to a university in Washington, D.C., and she was working as a nanny. And she was in charge of another family's 4-year-old. She was given a little car to drive the little boy around in, and she was at a stoplight. The stoplight turned green. She started to proceed forward. A car came through the red light. That was a big SUV, killed the little boy, left her in a coma and in very bad physical shape. My colleague and his wife flew down to D.C., and because he himself was a neurologist, they allowed him to see his daughter as to what was going on. And that family decided to try to see whether or not their daughter, if she made what they considered to be incremental improvement, that they would continue on with the medical treatment. But they had also had a discussion amongst themselves, between themselves, that if things were not working well, they would allow her to go. In this instance, okay, so that kind of shows what the value of a trial can be. In that instance, she was actually still recovering about 10 years afterwards. She has since married. She sang at her father's remarriage, and I was the best man there. So I can say that authoritatively. After hearing about her for 10 years, yeah.
What's the difference? You've got the advance directive, you've got a MOLST, and then you've got DNR. And I know I've been dealing with these things with my father, who passed away a couple of months ago, so I'm sort of familiar with it, but I mean, how does the DNR differ?
Okay, if you are in a hospital, and let's say that you have a, whatever your medical condition may be, that there is a concern that you may go into cardiac arrest or not do well with the therapy.
And DNR just...
DNR means do not resuscitate.
Right, okay.
Do not resuscitate. And so in speaking about that, the question is, what do you want to have done in the event your heart stops? Do you want to have everything done or have nothing done? And again, what people oftentimes don't understand is that when you say you want everything done, when you have the electric paddles that we see on TV all the time, did you know, for example, that one of the things that they also need to do then is to place you on mechanical ventilation? You don't see that on TV.
You don't see that, no.
Okay? So it's really onerous. The other thing is that the older you are, the more frail you are. CPR originally was made for young people who would make a healthy and relatively quick recovery. As you've probably noticed, our joints ache a little bit more, and our bones are a little bit more brittle. And when we try to do CPR on the body, we break more and more ribs. It takes longer to heal. And we don't do as well. We don't make the same kind of recovery that other people might make of a younger age. So do not resuscitate means that somebody is in bad state to begin with. And basically, how much discomfort do you want to place somebody through in hopes that they're going to pull through? The statistics are not very good for an in-hospital resuscitation if you are a frail elderly person 6 months out. They're not even good that you're going to leave the hospital. Other examples are that, and this is what often, not often, but sometimes happens, is that somebody who says, I do want CPR, I want everything to be done, I won't sign a do not resuscitate order. So when the event comes and the heart seizes and they go ahead and they resuscitate you, the person now is in a permanent vegetative state. Is
Now,
that how
Paul,
they wanted to live?
This has been fascinating. We're getting down to the wire. We have a few more minutes, but could you kind of encapsulate what a family should obviously start talking about, having the conversation about it, but what would you advise families to do?
I would suggest to everyone that they kind of look in the mirror and recognize where you are and what your own mortality is.
That's the tough part.
I know that's the tough part,
Yeah.
and I was asked by a group of students that were 18 and 19 years old few years ago whether or not they should have an advance directive, and I said yes, which shocked them. We need to talk about the future. One of the nice things about an advance directive is that you're planning for the future. You may be perfectly healthy now, but who would you want to make healthcare decisions for you? Would you want your mother, your father, your spouse, especially if you're in the middle of a divorce, to make those healthcare decisions for you?
That could be
for
tricky.
instance. Okay? And number two, do the people, and whether it be a friend or anyone else, do they share your values in terms of what is important? Do they know what is important to you? Because if you don't have an advance directive, then the family members are left to figure it out for themselves. And they may not know what you want.
Right.
And they are then left basically with guilt because did I make the right decision?
Now, I know that my doctor had given me this 5 wishes. Would you advise people to ask about that too?
Yeah, 5 wishes basically represent a living will, which is not officially recognized in the state.
Okay.
And what one might do, and it's still worth filling out because it then shows your state of mind and what is important to you. And it can be used as indicia or evidence of what it is that you want to be done or not done.
Okay.
And these things are very important to do. And it also then forces you to think about questions that you might not otherwise want to think about.
Right. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could go on for at least another half hour.
You think a college professor could talk a little longer? A former University of Massachusetts debater?
Well, I think so. I think you did a pretty good job. But, it would be great to have you come back on again to get into this a little deeper because there are so many questions and so many alternatives that, it has opened my eyes about a lot of different things. I mean, I thought I kind of had a handle on it, but
Well, you don't get a
really
handle on
don't.
it really until you have to deal with it.
Well, I
and I
did.
had to deal with it,
Yeah.
with my father.
Yeah.
All these different forms and all these different decisions.
Yeah.
And the good thing is my father had talked to us about it previously, so
Yeah.
it made the decision a lot
A
easier.
lot easier, yeah. Yeah, because I think you're right. I think families...
That's why
if
you have
they-
to start the conversation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
One more
do that.
thing. It's important for people to bring this topic up with their healthcare providers, with their doctors.
Yes,
Because doctors, again, oftentimes are reluctant to bring it up because of lack of time, because they're afraid that their patients are going to think unkindly about them because, is there something wrong with me? And in reality, it's just planning for the future.
well, I think in Massachusetts now, they're almost mandated to begin the conversation with the patients. I know that my doctor has been very open and above board about it, and she doesn't always agree with some of the things I've said, but
Who does?
that's right. Well, I know you don't. Thank you very much, Paul, and
Thank
please
you.
come back. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.